Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to our Sunday special live. And if you have been getting withdrawal symptoms, I know how you feel. I've been getting the nicotine patches as well. Just to get my fill for the missing, gaping hole in our lives has been Adam Lawrence. Since he's been on his whirlwind tour of wherever he is, I have no idea. But he's back, ladies and gentlemen, he's back and as big as ever. Tells me he's in America. And yeah, let's get on with it. We have Helen Chorley as always, sporting the pink. Piotr Rusinek, sporting the silence with the smile. I think we've got a lot to cover. It's been a couple of weeks. I think the 78.2% is probably going to be extended even further this week, perhaps.
I like the way I've gained 0.2. That sounds that's definitely less. That's definitely less weight than I've gained in percentage terms from being in the United States. That much is for sure. That much is for sure. Yeah, well, it's been emotional, folks. What can I say? It feels like an awfully long time. It's good to be back. I'm still going to miss next week because I'm going to be traveling, I'm afraid. But these things happen, These things happen. So I've one sort of slight bonus, I suppose, is that it certainly curbs my ability to write 50,000 words on a Sunday morning. So it's been even punchier and even more savage than usual over the past few weeks. Where I did a bit of a reflective piece, which was about looking after yourself and how to do it and how bad I'd got at it, especially by the time we had our third child. So took a bit of a long, hard look at myself, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. And talked about sort of what I've done so far along that, and just doing a bit better on that front. And I know Helen particularly has spent lots of time thinking and taking action on that as well, and talking about that as well, very, very openly over the past few years, which has been quite helpful and quite inspiring to me to have a think about that, because I think we have a tendency probably to not do that so much, because I can't remember the girl's name now, but she got in quite a lot of trouble for saying we've all got 24 hours in a day. I can't remember if she was on Love Island or something like that.
Molly May or something.
I'd probably get in trouble for calling her a girl, because I know Beckham's got in trouble for calling footballers girls, even though we seem to always call the men boys, because I guess there's a youth to their age when they're in a football team. And of course, we've got the Women's World Cup final coming up in a short while, which I've got penciled in for after the Sunday special. But apparently, you can't call people girls because other people are going to get offended on their behalf. But anyway, before we go down that route too early on, because we're only 3 minutes in, and that's definitely nothing to do with prophecy. And then the last couple of weeks, a few more bits and bobs have happened, really, which has been because the week before was really particularly slow on the property front and on the economics front, as it can be at this sort of time of year. But the economics factors haven't played ball and provided plenty to think about and talk about. And I think the bit that I focused on this week is I can't help but sneak in a bit in inverted commas of reading and monitoring of what's going on, and I see the void that once inspired me to create the supplement by reading a lot of the other commentary that's out there, because I'm reading things and just going, well, that's wrong, and that's nearly right, but it's kind of missed this and this, So this week particularly was just a bit of a reminder of why you sort of put the work in and why you do the detail to try and understand, if you put a really broad brush picture on it. Last month, when I say last month, I mean the figures that were released last month. So June's figures, which came out in July, were really positive in general. July's figures, which came out in the past 7 days, were really not that positive at all. And you've seen the bond and the swap markets react accordingly. We're back over the dreaded 5% on the 5-year swap. which doesn't bode well for mortgage rates. And whilst this is transitory, for want of a better word, it's as I've been saying for a long, long time, it's the length of this transitory period, which is a real problem, which is kind of like, is something a passing phenomenon when it lasts for 4 years? You decide, but that's sort of the length of time that we're looking at here. And unfortunately for all of us, we're only sort of 2.5 years into that 4-year period. There's still a fair few people going around saying interest rates are coming back to zero in short order. I don't know if that's related. Jay did tag me in the week and asked me if the great Dr. Michael Burry, the eponymous hero of The Big Short, apparently by his own admission, is put on 90% of his net worth in taking a short position on the stock market. I think my favourite comment on that post you did, Jay, I think was from Manish, who commented saying he's predicted 27 of the last 3 recessions or whatever.
But I mean, my response was he's a bit of an overachiever in that respect. But the reality is, how many of those has he backed with $1.6 billion?
Sure.
Yeah.
Which I it's a serious bet. I think it's probably overstated in terms of he's not going to lose that whole 1.6 billion if the recession doesn't happen by X. But there's been a fair amount of commentary over the past 6 to 9 months about recessions. I mean, if you put sort of Jeremy Grantham aside, who's another one who fits into the very nice, we're in a super bubble environment and the sky's going to be falling and blah, blah, blah. Although, again, he doesn't seem to do too badly for himself. And I don't know how much of that is about headlines and staying relevant and sounding, attractive to people who are bearish, which is probably 50% of the population these days. I'm not sure, but there's a lot of reasons to be not that positive. But I keep making the same. But it did make me think when I sat back and reflected on it. I keep making the same point about the property market, which obviously one of the major advantages about the resi market is it's so much less volatile than the stock market, and that's part of the almost the quandary really for people in the city is how well the property market has performed over the last 30 or 40 years when it's such a non-volatile asset. Now, of course, it's been more volatile for the last 18 months, just as every other asset class has been more volatile since COVID. But still, it still shows hallmarks of much less volatility even than the bond market, for example. And that's one thing that always has people scratching their heads. You shouldn't really get very low volatility, reasonable to high return markets, but the resi market has bucked that trend over the last 40 years. But the point that I keep making is if you compare, the beginning or the middle of 2022 to today, you've got an advancement in inflation of 8 to 12 to maybe 15%, depending on which number you're looking at. You've got a drop in pricing of a couple of percent, somewhere between 2 and 5%, depending on which index you trust and follow. And so you put those two things together and you've got a nearly 20% adjustment in the real price. And of course, the heady heights in the stock market were hit before 2022 started, because 2022 was a notoriously bad year for both stocks and bonds. So we're already 20% below that in real terms, inflation adjusted terms. Now, the stock market's got arguably, especially sort of the big stuff in the US stock market, which is all tech these days, is all tech. Tech companies are notoriously sensitive to the interest rate, and the interest rate has deteriorated quite a lot. And the US is still, even though the US is sort of, I keep saying about 12 months, it's a rough figure, but about 12 months further forward in this cycle than we are, their interest rate, their swap rates certainly are not as high as ours are at the moment. They're maybe 1% lower as a loose guide, although the shape of their yield curve is relatively different to ours. But they've still had that 20% adjustment in real terms. So this is kind of almost, it's starting to feel like the crash that never was. You know, if you put a 15% real terms adjustment in pricing next to the 2008 great financial crash, right, they don't look dramatically different, actually. The timescale is a little bit more compressed in 2008, but the peak to trough in real terms is relatively the same. So the message I'm reading out the back of that is we've had this adjustment that everybody seems to be calling for and waiting for, and therefore the people who I keep seeing and meeting and talking to, who are seasoned veterans, you know, people who've been in property for 10 plus years, who are saying, well, I'm just sort of waiting and seeing what happens at the moment, who might be sitting on quite big cash balances apart from anything else. I think they're wrong. I think they're completely wrong. And my fear is that, you know, they can do what they want. That's the nature of the beast, right? But while they're out there telling other people that it might be a good time to wait and see what happens, the trouble is people might wake up in 3 to 6 months' time, and the active traders, the savvier traders, you know, I like the way Pete van der Vennen, who runs the mortgage consultancy, who always comes to all of our PIP meetings and is our mortgage sponsor. He says, you know, look, I've had clients for, you know, knocking on 40 years, some of them, and the ones who've got the most money, to boil it down to that, are the ones who bought a lot of property around about 2008, 2009, 2010. And those sort of opportunities don't come up very often. And he said it feels a little bit like that at the moment. And I just strongly agree.
Bullish. You've got to be bullish.
I thought,
that stays in the office. That is a miniature of the bull in Wall Street.
Yeah.
For a moment, I thought it was a magic lamp, but I think I might have had
Stop rubbing it, yeah.
I think I might have had too much Disney over the last couple of weeks.
Piotr pops out of it. That's how you travel so much, isn't it, Piotr?
This is how Hammered achieves all the things that it has done. Right, the secrets are really coming out now. This is it. This is like, right, how did you win that property at auction? Well, it was one of my 3 wishes, gentlemen.
But that's what we're talking about with some like really kind of active agents that we've been speaking to, and basically like in London, what they're saying is like right now it's an opportunity to pick up stock that you wouldn't normally be able to pick up because there'll be so much competition for it. And right now it's an opportunity. If someone's sitting on cash, this is the time to be buying stuff like for generation. Maybe not with a view to sell in the next 6 months, but with a view to possibly hold for longer time. And we had the EIG newsletter coming out with the kind of figures for, I believe, July. That was for July, for the last month. And basically, there's more lots offered than there were the year ago. But the amount of money that's raised is like down 26% year on year.
6.8% down.
6.8%. So that's a lot of money that's not been raised, even though there was more profit offered in the same period. And there isn't really any seasonal kind of issues. It's more people not buying.
Yeah, the seasonal issues at auction mean nothing now. Everything's online. You can do what Adam's doing at 3:30 in the morning, wherever he is. You can just log onto your whatever, your laptop or your iPad, or other makes are available, and you can bid. It's easy as pie. You got an internet connection, you're good to go. And people are still doing deals. I know people are on holiday. I call them. It's an international ringtone. They're still there to be doing deals. They can do it from wherever. So it's, back in the day, it was a bit of an issue. 5 years ago, you just wouldn't do it. Even with a proxy bid. For those that were comfortable with a proxy bid, still wouldn't do it. But it's not an issue anymore. Hasn't been for 3 or 4 years. So that's not the problem. The problem is people just aren't picking up as much stock as they are. And the prices are getting keener. We're looking at... the properties that go unsold, we're paying very specific interest to those, whether we like them or not, because we want to see how quickly they're relisted back into auction and what the drop is, because that's really telling you where the motivated market is.
Yeah.
You would find maybe 10% of unsold lots are relisted into the next auction. It may not be the same auction, but it will be the next auction cycle. I'm of the opinion that's going to double, if not treble.
Mm.
And the price reductions, I think, on average, you'd see if something was up for 250, they'd knock it down to 225 or something like that. So, there'd be a 5% reduction or whatever. I think the reductions are going to come a little bit thicker and heavier. So if you are sitting on cash and you're looking for deals, auctions, as we bang that drum on a very regular basis, of course, is a great place to find those things. But then harkening back to a conversation we had must be a month or so ago now, is my inbox is now flooded with agents that haven't bothered to pick up a call to me, pick up a phone, pick up any of my calls for the last 6 months. All of a sudden, I'm at the top of their mail out list. But whilst they're doing that, they're thinking they're being more proactive. The pricing is wrong. So the number of times I get an email from this one chap relisting the same property 6 times because it may go under offer. But it's not beating the rental stress yields. It's not getting the LTV that people are looking for because the price is wrong. So it just keeps coming back. And I don't know who else is seeing that, but I imagine I'm not the only one.
Well, it's the old, there's only ever one thing with a property, right, is its price. I mean, that's not necessarily true, especially the sort of stuff we love to pick up. Is usually particularly badly marketed apart from anything else, but
yes,
that's a very, very niche little slice of what goes out there. Generally speaking, we know that the only thing that's really wrong with something generally on an average listing will be the price of it. And I think, there was some really interesting bits in the figures this week, leaving my deep love for inflation and the sub metrics and everything else I've been considering alone, it hasn't, as I said, the figures weren't great for this month. Core inflation looks sticky. Surprise, surprise. That cat came out the bag about 2.5 years ago, but it's playing out. And that's still really playing out in the markets in the world that are a little bit ahead of us. The European core inflation is still remarkably close to ours. The US core inflation has still been pretty sticky to the downside, and that's the problematic one. And along with that, the services inflation is problematic because apart from anything else, it's the services industry in the UK where the wages have been driving forward and forward. And if you look without really scratching the surface, unemployment's gone from 3.8 to 4 to 4.2 in 2 months. That's pretty dramatic, actually, by our relatively modern standards. But services inflation is 7.6 because wage inflation is 8.2. So, the people are taking a slightly bigger bite of the cherry. But by the time you adjust the 8.2 for the last 12 months of inflation, the real terms wage rise is about 0.5%. And the real terms pay cut during what's been dubbed the cost of living crisis, whether you like the phrase or not, was about 3.5%. So even with that scratch back, that sort of that hand on the mountain, there's still another 3% to get back to where we were a couple of years ago, which obviously is where people want to be in real terms, and that's what matters. But 8.2% average wage rise is startling, and that's what's really upset the markets this week. And interestingly, the 4.2 is not companies shedding labour as quickly as they possibly can because the price of labour has gone up so much and blah, blah, blah. It's this idea that I remember being in a Bank of England meeting maybe 12 months ago, maybe 15 months ago, and they were talking about these 500,000 odd people that had opted out of the workforce post-COVID who were not 65, who were primarily 50 plus, but not exclusively. and they were saying, right, well, these people are out of the workforce, they're gone. People don't come back to the workforce once they've left it. And I remember sitting and thinking, maybe that's true, but if you toss 12-15% inflation into the mixer, then unless the people who've left the workforce have factored in life's about to get a hell of a lot more expensive, then guess what? Their better laid plans are going to be in tatters, and they will be back in the workforce.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, now bear in mind, the Bank of England and I at that date would have disagreed massively on where the path of inflation was going. And rightly or wrongly, I was right and they were wrong. So they hadn't factored that into their analysis, whereas I had. And what you've seen over the last couple of months is people coming back to the workforce in droves, not necessarily straight into a job, but seeking work, making themselves available. You know, there is friction in that situation where people say, and there's probably quite a few of you know, anecdotally, the people that I know who are maybe in their early 50s who've said, oh, I was working, you know, they worked their way into a very big position, as you tend to in a traditional career. You know, your income path tends to go up until your mid to late 50s, and then it starts to come back down a bit as you ease off the gas a little bit as you head towards a traditional retirement age. And they were sitting thinking, well, I'm earning X 100,000 quid a year. You know, I'm still having to work all the hours that God sends for it. Why am I bothering? They might be coming back to the job market to take something a lot less ambitious. And even if they're as ambitious as they ever were, having left their job, you know, 18 months ago, 24 months ago, is going to seriously dent their career prospects in terms of who's going to hire them. But the point is, they're back in the shaker, they're back in the figures, they're now seeking work where they weren't seeking work. And it takes a few months for those positions and those kinks to work themselves out. So this isn't a, you know, companies shedding labour, start to panic, start of a recession, guaranteed this, that, and the other. It's just some of this stuff working its way back out. But of course, if you do inject 100,000 of those people back into the labour market, and the amount of vacancies there are falling because companies are hiring fewer, even if they're not shedding labour at a rapid rate, they are hiring fewer people. Then you've got what looks a bit more like a functional clearing labour market rather than one which is going to see 8% pay rises become a normal affair, because companies, especially big corporates, will be keen to sort of snap that off as quickly as they possibly can. But I did throw back this week to there's a piece of work that I did in the supplement, which is nearly 3 years ago now, around pandemics and the sort of long-term historical effects that you tend to see. You know, GDP tends to suffer to the tune of about 1% a year for 40 years. Labour tends to grab more of a share of the pie than capital does. And you forget these sort of long-term wave trends that have happened since Dr. Michael Burry was so very correct in 2008. You know, capital has tended to perform pretty well. You know, it's the labour and the people who've really taken the financial crisis on the chin as a whole, and certainly in the UK in the public sector, where they've got mullered by inflation, linked pay rises, which is what's caused all the fuss with the doctors, apart from anything else. And of course, the people see it as, well, this is finally our chance to make good. But you know, retail sector is really struggling in terms of real term figures. You know, if their sales go up 1% and their wages go up 8%, and of course retail tends to employ quite a lot of minimum wage workers, you know, their rates are up over 10%. Well, if your revenues grow by 1.5% and your wage costs grow by 10.5%, you can see where the maths goes on that one, and they already don't necessarily work to the biggest margins in the world. Once you throw in the fact that companies are trying to move away from China rather than do more with China, you see that the maths doesn't necessarily stack up that well in the retail sector, and it's going to continue to struggle apart from anything else. But you know, I suppose put yourself in the what the question I probably didn't ask myself enough this week is, what if Michael Burry is right, and then what would that do to the interest rate in the US, for example? Would it then force them cut the interest rate because they wouldn't want the stock market to take a big beating. And I guess in the US, it would be interesting to see, because the Federal Reserve have got the most credibility they've had for years. They could do anything. They've left the door open to do pretty much anything. They've got the market believing they might still put the interest rate up a bit more. But if there was a real crash in the stock market, rather than, one thing about 2022's efforts it was like a slow death. It was like a march towards mediocrity, really. It wasn't a crypto style blow off top. It was a little path downwards that just kept on wiggling downwards and downwards for most of the year. And most of that has been regained, although, as I say, in nominal terms, it's been regained, but in real terms, it's still blown off a good 12, 13%, something like that. So could we be looking at interest rates coming right back down? I think in the UK, the resounding answer to that is no at the moment, because the inflation figures, they still couldn't even countenance it. In the US, it's a different kettle of fish, but a lot of the sensible commentators seem to think that even if we've seen this sort of transitory wave work its way through the system, there's still a sting in the tail of somewhere between 1% and 3% extra inflation, which is now in the system, which is really hard to iron out, and it will take a period of flatness to iron it out, really. But we'll see. We'll see as time goes on, I think. And I think, I think what Jay and Piotr said around the auction side of things, it's really, it's really important to rebuild those relationships. If those relationships are now picking up the phone to you, as Jay was saying, and remember that if you're not doing that work, somebody else will be. So if in 3 to 6 months' time you realise that actually what Jay just said was very right, and there's more repricing, and the supply and demand imbalance is even more in favour of the buyers, because there's more sellers and more people. For example, approaching tax return season, January 31st, 2024 might be quite interesting, as people, especially landlords hit by Section 24, think, blimey, I've had a terrible year in terms of cash flow. And then they'll look at their tax bill, because this is the one where things have really started to increase for them. But actually, January the 31st, 2025 is, presuming the rates stay that high for this tax year, for all the landlords who were on base rate trackers, they'll be feeling it in their bank balances. But will they understand the disparity between what their tax bill still is and the fact that they're struggling to cash flow or even losing money just for the sake of holding onto a portfolio? I put a bit in a piece of work I wrote this week. I was asked by the editor of the Property Chronicle to submit something for consideration for next quarter, which was always a nice stroke of the ego apart from anything else. So I've submitted it. It was lower than my usual 78.2% demands, and there was no prima donna ability just yet. But I did write in there about or in very short form, which obviously is not my usual bent. But I did write in there about that impact that sort of phenomenon is having, and I did also write about the potential shortness of the time. There's a nature of, because property moves slowly, there's an ability to do not a lot for the next 9 months, let's say, and then realise that the world has passed you by a little bit, and the bottom and the opportunities have really gone. And there's a great Buffett talks about this a lot. One of the things that he has prided himself on is the ability to sit on his hands and not tinker with stuff. And that's very true. But if you look back at the great acquisitions of Berkshire Hathaway, right, they've tended to happen in times which haven't been the most economically rosy, and he made an awful lot of money in 2008, 2009.
Oh yeah.
Because he saw some phenomenal opportunities, and he knew businesses like when he propped up Goldman Sachs,
Exactly.
he knows it's a phenomenal business that would endure the times that have just got a bit too overexcited. And this is, like Jay was saying, that these deals that just, they're just not necessarily going to come up again, some of these deals. And you might just have to bite the bullet. And yes, it might be a slight, I always remember the story that you tell, Jay, about the office block not a million miles away from home for me on the Hagley Road. You just wouldn't be able to buy that. And okay, that trade might take, I can't remember how long you said it took, but if it took 12 to 24 months to sort it all out, okay, it might not be a very nice quick flip, but you could be talking about a return of 10 times the purchase price or something equally ridiculous in a relatively short space of time. So the problems sort of change a little bit, and you have to change with those problems. Or for extremely rarely for me, one of the things that I pointed out this week is there's a ton of rent-to-rent opportunities still around and available. And the first problem is finding the good ones, of course. And the number one question, which I think probably zero people point out on the courses that they sell, is that finding out the financial position of the landlord is absolutely key at the moment, because if they're suffering, if they've got, I'll give an example. We're looking at a big portfolio at the moment, but the problem that portfolio has got is that the gross yield on it is about 6%. And at the moment, at 6%, it doesn't cash flow.
No. I mean, I was talking to some, say, a varied groups, and I would say more on the beginner intermediate side, saying that, some of them were saying, oh, we're waiting for the bottom of the market. We've seen the top of the market. I said, well, you need to think about this logically. The bottom of the market is probably a 30-minute moment in time. It's a 30-minute moment in time. The top of the market is probably another 30-minute moment in time where something sells for an absolute pinnacle or something sells for absolute trash. The rest of it is value basis points where you're starting, right, I'm a 7% yield person. Okay, well, you now can pick this up for 10%. That is bottom end of your market for you in terms of your value point. If you're normally picking up at 7, you're now picking up at a 10, you're ahead. You're ahead. If you are further north of where I sit now, and you are normally a 14 to 16% yield person, you're now picking up 20 to 22%, you're now at the bottom of your market. If you were to track those trends over the last 20 years, chances are those are the best kind of bottom market yielding things that you're going to pick up at any point in time. So stop waiting for everything to go down to a bargain bucket pound price point. It's not going to happen. So if you can find the value point and you can appreciate the value point and you can structure it and finance it and exit it, or not exit it, as some people will keep, most people keep, then do that. Stop looking for this mythical thing that doesn't exist. And when you're making offers, make offers at that, what you would consider, okay, this is what the bottom of my marketplace looks like for my asset class in my golden area, whatever people focus on. We're not very good at that. We buy where the deals are. But most people are location focused and price point focused and yield focused. So if that's the case, focus on that. That's where your offers need to be. And don't be afraid of rejection just because someone will say yes sooner or later. You'll find someone that's in the right position to accept your right offer at the right time. You have to offer through mounds of shit to get there. But you'll get there. It's out there.
So I think that's where the work is at the moment. Where the work needs to go in is in firing those offers in, and or just sorting through the deals to find the ones where people are being realistic, that are taking all those things into account. That's what you were just saying, Jay, reminded me of a friend of mine. A friend of mine started a company some years ago, and it's been very successful. And it's been through it's now on its second iteration of venture capital funding. So when the second VCs came in, the first VCs get to sell out, and he got to sell something like 20% of his shares or something like that. It was for a significant sum of money. Obviously, the majority of it is still inside the company. but it's an international company, and that money came in dollars. And of course, like all these things, the deal took about 6 months longer than anybody would have wanted it to take. But happily for him, it actually closed around early October last year. And he was on the phone to me every 5 minutes, what seemed like, to say, when should I move these dollars over to pounds? And I was like, look, hello, not a Forex trader. In fact, relatively negative about Forex traders, present company accepted, of course, but I'm talking about two Forex traders who lease Lamborghinis and try and persuade people they're good at it, not real Forex traders. But I said exactly what Jay just said. Zoom out 20 years and look at the pound versus the dollar. And it was the morning he got the money was where, and another thing that Jay just said, coming into fruition, the Hong Kong market had opened. I think that's about 4:30 a.m. or something like that. There'd been some money that had traded at something like $1.03 to the pound. And actually the volume that was traded was a tiddly little amount. And that wasn't a real price that any real big money traded at. But that had happened, and then it came back up to 104, 106 by the time England woke up properly. And I was like, look, it just looks exceedingly good value to me, zooming the graph out. Are we about to collapse as an economy? No, it seems like we'll probably get a handle on this and get rid of her, because she'd already started to come under a serious amount of pressure. And sure enough, I think he got his trade done and he was banking with a private bank, so he got the spot price minus a tiny commission of about 0.1% or something like that.
Bloody hell. And
within a few days, he'd gone from the 108 that he managed to achieve. We were back to 112, 113. And now today we're 127. So there was nearly 15 to 20% in that trade. And he's, of course, not in the habit of moving seven-figure sums of money from dollars to pounds. So it was a phenomenal result for him. And when the discussion first started with the VC flipping out to the other VC, the price had been closer to 140. So he went from 140 to 108, which has now come back to 127. And that's exactly what people could be looking at in the middle of next year when we come back to this sort of discussion about where pricing has been, especially when you look at the way Jay's just described it. If you're looking at, yield based, I'm preferring the cash on cash sort of way of looking at things at the moment, because it's boiling down for people. And we do have to sort of temper that conversation with, when the interest rate is zero, I'm talking about the base rate, obviously, rather than what we could borrow money at, but when the interest rate is zero, 4% net yield can look okay. It can look pretty good. When the interest rate is five and a bit, obviously 4% doesn't work. So we do need to bear that in mind. But, this is why I prefer cash on cash, because you force yield by buying at the right price. And yes, there's lots of work to do with firing these offers out there. And yes, there will be a few that you might offend or whatever. So you do have to couch them in the right sort of way. But at the moment, if you're not getting the offers out there, that's where you're going to be missing out in a big way, because getting the volume of offers out, managing those pipelines, as Jay, this is some of the deals we'd love to pull off that are in the pipeline at the moment. The only thing that's getting in our way is pie in the sky buyers, and the vendor then says, "Oh, I've got someone." It's like, "Oh, yeah, so have I. Yeah, his name's Ken, and he's recently been in a film, but he'll be able to get the mortgage." And it's like, that's interesting. What interest coverage ratio do you think you'll be using? Oh, what's that? I was like, well, he's going to need pixie dust unless he's sitting on quite a lot of money in the bank. And this is the conversation we had about this big portfolio. The guy was like, have you got the money to buy it? I'm like, without being too much of a dick about it, my balance sheet's quite a lot bigger than this portfolio. But what I haven't got is the money to just sprinkle in there because you'd quite like it. I've got money that can go in if there's returns there. But if there's no returns there, why am I going to, not being funny, guys, but why am I going to put the money in? Yeah. Well, we've got a good mortgage at the moment until for the next 12 months. Oh, great. Okay, I'll just buy these properties for the next 12 months, then I'll give them back, will I? Oh, no, I won't. All right, okay. So we need to have a think about what's happening after 12 months, don't we? Well done for getting that loan when you got it in 2019 or whatever it was, round of applause. But all that really gives you is 12 months great cash flow before you come back to the market. And then, this is the reason why you're selling it, right? So we need to have a bit of a sensible conversation around the medium-term landscape of the interest rate. Well, I think the interest rates are going to go back down. Oh, well, I don't think they are. So perhaps we just talk in 12 months' time. That's fine, but we'd probably be talking at a bit more of a potentially savage level at that point, when that's proven to be incorrect and you've got 3 months left and then you're looking at negative cash flow. But it's up to you. It's up to you.
Yeah, where's the risk on that? If they go back down, like, great. And you're right, great. If they don't, you got a bigger problem there, mate.
Exactly.
Got a really good comment from Guy Charlson, as usual. Morning all, go England. Adam, the US seem to have the confidence that we don't. I'm not denying the underlying economic fundamentals, but the US seem to have a more positive outlook. You don't hear all the time of the cost of living. Jay, great comment about 30-minute top and bottom of the market. Best wishes to you all.
There's a lot of chat about America, and whilst they are a big economic cog in the system that is planet Earth, I'm not too fussed. The things that worry me is how much did Russia increase their last interest rate from 7.6 to 12%? Was that the most recent one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, how long does that last for, right? Before Putin starts blowing up oil pipes or turning off taps, which negatively affect Europe, which negatively affect us, which negatively affect so. And then all of a sudden you start seeing inflation. You start seeing, fuel poverty is what you'll start seeing. And that's not a new thing. That's not a COVID thing. That's not a Brexit thing. That is something we've been seeing for 20 years. Elderly people not being able to choose between food and heating, that kind of fuel poverty. That's real poverty. That's not a buzzwordy political thing that's been fannied about for the last 3 years. That's real. That's been there. It used to be said that the quality of the country you lived in was based on how they treated their most vulnerable people. And we are shit. We are beyond pathetic. I mean, we're not even talking like third world issues, because third world countries take care of their elderly and their young or their disabled exceptionally very well. Compared to us, we don't. As a market economy as we are globally, it's shocking actually. So I think Adam's right. I don't think interest rates are going to go down. Do I think that Russia has the ability to tank international markets? Yeah. Do I think Dr. Burry's got a little bit of an inkling as to that might be a pressure that applies a downward force? Possibly. Did America's debt get devalued from AAA to AA in the last 3 months? Yeah. In terms of debt across Europe and America, how is England sitting? Fairly peachy. So these things have to be taken into consideration massively, right? I mean, what is the value of debt? How much can you leverage your GDP against debt that you borrow internationally? That's important.
It's a good question, isn't it? Because there is no answer to that question. There's this. What I love, it's one of those things when you start peeling back the onion. David Cameron was obsessed with this for a little while until it was relatively obvious that he wasn't necessarily going to contain it. But there was this kind of 90% figure, and there's all these figures that the EU give the member states as guides of, you must, and it's a bit like the NATO situation. You must spend 2% of your money on defence. Then obviously what happens is nobody does, apart from America. Yeah. And then when it kicks off, everybody goes, well, we should have been spending 2% of our money on defence, so they try and fix the leaky bucket. Whereas the point of fact is, if you've signed a treaty that says you should do that, you should have been doing it. It's realistically the situation. Otherwise, you end up a bit, or in the UK anyway, you end up beholden to a bit of a dictator. I I mean, being in the States for a couple of weeks, I know Guy is right in terms of the general attitude is much more just sort of get on with it, just get on with it. And if you can, you see the good and the bad side of that as I'm a geek. I'm an interested observer of things that happen. You flick the TV on, and it reminds me a bit of years ago. I used to think, blimey, who would advertise on TV if it wasn't for gambling companies? Because every bloody advert we have seems to be for Bet365, right?
Yeah.
The same applies in the States for healthcare, and we've been having a bit of a running joke about some of these healthcare adverts because obviously it's federal law that they have to go through all the potential side effects. So
the disclaimers are longer than the adverts.
Yeah, exactly. Take this pill, which can help with your headaches. This could lead to serious suicidal tendencies, complete death, being undrawn and quartered, or turn you into a pirate or something like that. But nevertheless, it's quite a good pill sort of thing. But it's just dominated so much by big pharma, which obviously is not. It just doesn't happen at all in the UK. And obviously,
the US is highly skilled in boosterism, right? Actually, boast. That was a good Freudian slip. They do boosterism as well, but that's what they do. They're a big capitalist market. It's democratically elected, all that kind of stuff. But capitalism is huge. That's the American way. So when they're saying, "Oh, it's all bad," they don't say that. It's like, "Oh, okay, this has happened, but we're going to do this." America's great, blah blah blah, and it's a completely different pathology instead of mindset.
That's it.
That's
absolutely.
That the population has.
But you've also got this kind of idea of how much debt could they service, or how much. And the thing is, you get stuck in a very similar sort of. We get told how much we can borrow to an extent in terms of rental yields, although also there is obviously things like top slicing are available if you've got other income or you've got this, that, or the other. And top slicing is great for bailing you out of a situation. It's not necessarily the way you're going to want to look at buying new deals. But when you look at the money that these economies bring in, I mean, just in the UK, which is obviously tiddly compared to the US, when you've got tax revenue approaching £1 trillion a year, you maybe didn't need to get so worked up about what percentage of your GDP the debt is. And you've seen, and these are not necessarily economies that you want to emulate, despite Liz Truss's greatest insistencies, but Italy, Greece, Japan being the big one, really. What sort of level of percentage of debt to GDP they've carried? Bear in mind, we carried 250% after World War II, most of which was, at least underwritten, let's say, by the Marshall Plan and the States. But that doesn't make 90 to 100% sound that much more worrying. Now, of course, the problem, this is a bit like the bounce back loan situation in a way, or the reverse of it. Bounce back loan was incredible because on the face of it, you looked at it and said, so they're going to lend me money at 2.5% interest and there's no security. Right, okay, let me have a think about that for less than 1 second before I borrow as much as I can. Right, but of course the problem comes, and this is what has been happening for people, certainly with C-bills loans, which haven't necessarily been at 2.5% interest, is it's not the interest rate you're paying back at, it's the actual cash flow of the capital repayment in relatively short order. Now, of course, we all know the greatest scheme in the world is that these big economies, these deficit economies like the UK and the US, they have no need to pay the capital back. They just keep on rolling, right? Just keep on issuing the debt. And remember, they are big beneficiaries of the fact that, again, what's another thing we should talk about in real terms rather than nominal terms? What is the debt? Now, it is interesting to look at where there was that. I always forget who left the note that said, have a good time, there's no money left or whatever in the Treasury. Because it wasn't Alistair Darling, it was some wag of a Treasury Secretary, I think. I can't remember his name, but the debt has gone from, there's multiple ways of framing this from a political perspective, but the debt's gone from 885 billion in 2010, where we'd already done a reasonable amount of the bailing out we needed to do, but not all of it after the financial crisis, to like 2.4 trillion or whatever it is today. So in a way, that's trebled, and it makes it look like a bit of a joke to say the Conservatives are the party of fiscal conservatism, for want of a better word, but also we do need to consider the real terms number rather than the nominal terms number. And we do need to consider the fact that in those days, where the economy would have brought in, say, I think about 400 billion, 440 billion, maybe I'd have to look it up to make sure I've got the right number, but about 440 billion in tax revenue. We're now bringing in nearly 1 trillion in tax revenue. So our earning, UK PLC as an earning device, is bringing in 150% more. So if the debt's up a little bit more than 150%, okay, it's not ideal, but it's not as bad as it sounds, in comparative terms. So as always, things need to be put into context before we get too carried away. But the fact that we don't really need to pay back the debt, and that's the, can you imagine if you worked in the Treasury when you get to that realization the one day, you get into the job and they say, does anybody ever talk about the fact we're never paying any of this back? And everyone's like, shh. Just do some spreadsheets, lift up some red suitcases. Sound like you know what you're talking about. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Whereas we actually have to, a lot of businesses, a lot of SMEs at the moment are feeling the pinch in making those capital repayments every month for things like those bounce back loans. For those who haven't kicked out the payment terms, they're nearly 3 years into those cycles now. Some of them might only be a couple of years in. But if you kicked out the payment terms to the full 10 years, then you have the benefit of the 1 year where you didn't need to make any payments, which was an absolute godsend. But then you woke back up again and found your cash flow was relatively impacted. And the downside of capital repayment, of course, is that it's after-tax money that you're repaying. If you're making an accounting profit nowadays, especially if you're an SME that fits into that 50 to 300k profit per year category, you're now paying 26.5% corporation tax before you pay your capital repayment, and there might not be a lot left in the tank. And at the lower end, you're going to see more and more cash flow problems, I think, as you go through this cycle. But part of that is what will stimulate the sort of behaviour that Jay and Piotr were talking about earlier, where people have to go, well, do you know what? Actually, maybe we need to, for example, in commercial property, sale and lease back the premises that we're in, because we just need that cash for cash flow for the business. Business is still viable, right? But we don't need a £1 million asset that's sitting on the books at 400k that we might be able to raise 750 grand against, and we don't want to go to the market for a loan against it, because a loan is coming in at 10% at the moment, and we can't afford that 10% in the cash flow. It won't sort us out. But if we sold the asset and leased it back at a lower than 10% yield, but still an acceptable payment, actually, it puts several £100,000 in the bank, and the cash flow can absorb it, and it becomes a bit of a no-brainer from the company perspective.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point.
Indeed.
Got some interesting comments. Payam's been very active. Good point on Russia. There are lots of unknowns when it comes to interest rates and inflation, and the market's been wrong several times in the last 12 months. Also, China, the problem is going to come down the line.
China's been an interesting thing over the past, 12 to 18 months, really, because there's multiple things going on. Everybody thought there'd be this big resurgence when they opened back up. Didn't really happen. Whether the population are permanently scarred from quite how seriously they took the COVID thing. Although you have seen throughout the world a bit of a roaring 20s style COVID boom. There's the supposed cost of living crisis combined with the biggest amount of holiday bookings that I think there's ever been in the UK this year, and where people sort of said, sod it, we'll do it. That might well filter down the pipe. But the bigger thing is to come off the back of COVID is whatever you want to call it, friendshoring or onshoring. But the point is getting away from China. The goods markets absolutely blew up during COVID, and then have come right back down as people have had to cut down because the price of everything's gone up so much. Will China ever gain that resurgence? And when you take apart some of its GDP figures that were coming in, And obviously there were people that were very skeptical when they were printing 7.5% a year GDP. When you take out some of the property development in that, which was performing at one point, they reckoned about 4% of GDP, which is fine on paper from an accounting perspective. But if you're building flats for people that don't exist, that for jobs that aren't being created in areas where actually the population is shrinking, not growing, or certainly the working age population is shrinking, not growing, then you haven't really got much of a proposition. So I think that's why a lot of the commentators have started to move away from talking about China as an exciting emerging market and move towards talking about India, because China's loss is India's gain, and China's geopolitical position is just so much more threatening than India's geopolitical position. And India do have the demographics in their favour in terms of the labour and everything else. And that's why, world trade is in a state of flux, realistically. But there are, and it's by no means India as the only beneficiaries of friendshoring. Because, of course, the implication behind friendshoring is we do business with people who are more politically friendly to us, brackets, than China are, rather than onshoring, which is bringing the call centres back to Sunderland or wherever the new call centre capital of the UK happens to be. And basically the other implication being we still maintain the low cost of outsourcing what we do, but it's not outsourced to China. And of course, India's always had the advantage when it comes to their reputation for IT consultancy services and things like that, and those are more and more in demand as tech can do more, as AI can do. You may well be, if you're a really, really small business, you can replace a lot of some of the things you might have been doing. Let's say graphic designers are in trouble, aren't they? Because you can just go on Mid-Journey these days and get it done for you or whatever. But what you can also do is you can outsource the AI doing bits to India, and they can do all the legwork bits of it for you. Abby!
Here she is.
Looks like we have reminders from all over the place that it's 10 o'clock. It's also mentioning handing over the baton to Adam Lawrence. I was only would have finished by 9:55.
Mate, we're gonna need you back next week anyway, Safe. So don't go too far. I was hoping there might be a Mighty Five performance at some point, so we can square the circle actually. But let's see how we go. But next week I'm going to be in the air at the time of the special, so I don't think the plane Wi-Fi is going to handle it.
Actually, next week we've got a property sister and your pip buddy Jess Macaulay on next week. So girl power.
Saves traveling next week as well. So we're having a property sister join us.
The vagaries of August, but I'm sure she'll do a fantastic job. Has she negotiated 78.2% or lower? Or
I think that depends on the result of the World Cup final. It's starting in an hour.
Well, good luck to the girls, if we might be so bold. Or even
good luck to the Lionesses. May they destroy the Red Furies.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for commenting, tuning in every week, or not every week, but whenever you guys can. And thanks for contributions you guys made to today's chat. So we'll be back next week with slightly adjusted team, but entertaining as always.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great week, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.